Cool. And it's great to introduce our think tank interaction for our second annual Women in Politics and Policy seminar. I think based on some of the conversations we've been having so far that have explored whether there are more than one or two ways to or lenses or to approach an issue by happenstance, we've ended up with a very good organization to represent us into the think tank world. I'm going to turn it over to our student leader for this session, Laura, who will introduce our panelists and our special alumni bonus guests for the session.
Of course. Thank you so much, Eric. So I am Laura Vega. I am a political science major, and I will be moderating this session. It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jillian McGrath. She is a policy advisor for Third Way Economics program. She researches issues about economic stability and security of the American families by researching programs such as SNAP, TANF, and WIC. These are food programs that help feed America. She has also conducted detailed outcomes analysis using the census and SNAP data. And she holds a bachelor's degree in political science and economics, as well as a master's in applied economics from the University of Maryland. Okay, so let's move on to Tamara. Tamara, I do not know how to pronounce your last name. I'm so sorry.
No problem. It's Hiler.
Hiler. Okay, Tamara Hiler. She leads the education program at Third Way. And this includes creating strong relationships with Hill staff and other advocacy groups dedicating to improving student outcomes through increased transparency and inclusion in higher education. She has also laid a comprehensive policy platform to modernize teaching. She has pushed it through Congress while maintaining a strong role in testing and accountability provisions to rewrite No Child Left Behind. She also graduated with a BS in health promotion and disease prevention studies from the University of Southern California and holds a master in public administration from Northern University. At last, we have our FIU alumni, Taylor also worked, last names. Taylor worked at Third Way, and she will have the opportunity to ask the first question.
No, I'll have to think of a question.
Or introduce or talk a little bit about your time at Third Way and what you're doing then. And
I'm quick on my feet.
Yeah.
Come up with a question. Certainly after working with Tammy for years, I'm certain I can come up with a good question for her. But I will. Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to see all your faces on the screen and to know that this line is now in its second year. This was a really exciting project that the FIU and DC team has had for a long time. So it's awesome to see this happening. But I'll just take a few minutes before we hand off to the main event with Tammy and Jillian. But because my worlds are colliding between FIU and Third Way, I really just want to take a few minutes to tell you my FIU and DC story. And forgive my background and huge apologies if my internet goes out. I'm at the barracks in Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and I think I'm commandeering internet from one of my sergeants. So if I go blank, just take it over, Tammy. But I am, as I said, a proud product of the FIU and DC experience. So I would love to hear while I'm speaking, if you want to write in the chat room, in the chat box, just share what you're excited about this week, what you've been looking forward to, if it's different than what you expected, or if you've heard a session that really piqued your interest. Feel free to write them in the chat, because I think that would be really interesting for all of us to hear from each other and share that collective enthusiasm. But I first worked in DC in 2009. I worked at Peace Corps headquarters, and I knew from that first week, that god awful first summer in DC that's so hot, I knew that I wanted to stay in DC, walking around the Capitol building for the first time and experiencing everything that's there. And so when I went back to Miami to finish my senior year and my thesis work, I researched all the possible ways that would lead me back to the Capitol. And it was through Model UN and student government that I actually met Carlos and learned about the FIU and DC experience. And that's what brought me to in the fall of 2010, after I graduated. Carlos brought me up to DC, and the rest is history. I stayed there for a decade. And 2010 was a really interesting year because it was, for those that might be familiar with kind of the appropriations process, Congress was still earmarking back then. So the appropriations process and our advocacy strategy was really different. So Carlos was his first year in DC as well. So he's a wealth of information if you are curious just kind of about the history of the appropriations process and how the FIU strategy has shifted even in the last 10 years. It's really an interesting, kind of an interesting tale. But I found my niche working in policy, and that really, working with FIU and DC really satiated my love of policy and learning about the process. And it inspired me to work for many years at Third Wave with brilliant minds like Tammy and Jillian, where I just got that firsthand experience being exposed to economic and social policy that changed hearts and minds. We got to work on a lot of really important campaigns that showcased, for me, and what pivoted my career was the communications aspect, the messaging behind economic and social policy, and how it resonates with the electorate, and how a simple word even, or a phrase, or how you frame a policy or a bill, how that can shift the electorate and impact federal law and even a Supreme Court decision. And so I had incredible opportunities to work on a presidential committee, to transform government, learn from business leaders across America about how they were upskilling their communities in a changing economy. I traveled around the country, hearing from veterans, understanding why their health benefits were so difficult for them to access. I spoke with countless and made countless friends across the aisle that challenged my thinking and really allowed me to expand my intellectual bubble and really develop a lot more empathy and find common ground on issues that I thought I was right about all along. And it really forced me outside of that dichotomy. And I remember the first time I tried mumbo sauce. If you guys haven't tried that, I know you're only in DC for a little amount of time, but if you get a chance to do some local exploring in a COVID safe way, try some mumbo sauce, try and listen to some go-go music. But overall, the experiences I had over a decade were really invaluable to me and provided the platform for my career. Even now, even after a decade, I moved out west for a career in global health communications and through my service with the National Guard. But the FIU and DC experience was pivotal for that. And working at Third Way was really the foundation for the work that I still continue to do in advocacy and communications. And so I will always value that time with Carlos and FIU and DC and really encourage, if I can, I want to leave you with 3 nuggets of kind of advice during this fly-in and as you consider if it's an opportunity for you to join the FIU and DC internship or Universe Network. I want to leave you with kind of 3 nuggets of advice before I hand over to the main event. But number 1 would be learn as much as you can. You have access to a wealth of knowledge and expertise, both within the FIU community and FIU and DC, but within DC. And you're in one of the most amazing, interesting cities in the world. So be a sponge to this environment as much as you can, again, within the reality of our environment this year. Number 2 would be to network. And I say that with the most positive connotation. Expand your universe. People come to DC because they're passionate and they really believe in what they do and what they want to achieve. And so as much as you can, use this experience to expand your network of potential mentors, future colleagues, thought partners, and generally people that inspire you. And that's my third piece of advice is be inspired by this week. In all that you're learning, all that you're hearing, whether it resonates with what you've already thought you wanted to do, or if it's piqued your interest and made you start considering other options for how you want to move forward. Be inspired with this. And if it inspires you to move to DC and start your own decade, or if you take this information back to Miami or to other communities and really build kind of a grassroots movement of your own, whatever that looks like, let this short time kind of bring you closer to your purpose. So I'll stop there. Really love, I see a few comments, so glad folks were able to contribute. I'll make sure that my email is in the chat as well, because I don't want to take any time away from Jillian and Tammy and Laura, but would love to hear from you. If you have any questions for me or any advice about DC or your own path, I'm an open book. You're more than welcome to reach out to me. So I will make sure that my email is in the chat.
And Taylor, Taylor, if you don't mind, before you turn it over, I just want to say that Taylor made a very lasting impact at Third Way. And I just want to say that, one of the things she's being really modest about when she's talking about working on communication strategies and messaging work that has really changed the course of our country. She was integral to the work that we did at Third Way to sort of change the policies around marriage equality, and was really integral there. And so one of my favorite memories, I'll just share and then I'll turn it over, is that the day that the Supreme Court, officially legalized marriage for gay couples in our country, Taylor unfortunately was out of the state. She was visiting her grandparents, or you were somewhere. And I knew how important, because that is one of the things of living in DC that's really special. When there is a moment like the Supreme Court making announcement, like as soon as it happened, all of Third Way, we were just like, we're going to the court. Like we all just left the office and we went down to the Supreme Court so we could be there. But we cut a little flat, we cut a picture of Taylor out and put it on a popsicle stick, and we call her Flat Taylor. So Taylor got to be in all of the pictures with us at the Supreme Court, and Flat Taylor still lives on in my office, which I haven't even been to for like a year, but she still is at Third Way. So I just want to share that, Taylor's a great resource for all of you. Like, and when she says like, reach out to me, don't hesitate. Like it's not empty words. I promise you, she's a great mentor. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate you. Thank you all. I appreciate your time. And again, enjoy the rest of the session with Tammy, Jillian, and Laura, and the rest of your time during your fly-in this week. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Taylor. So going from Taylor's question, she asked us to reflect on experiences we had this week. We've had experiences with learning about mortality rate for pregnant women. We've even had a passionate discussion about formula versus breastfeeding. And that follows into my next question, which is for Jillian. You've recently written about the pandemic's impact on women in the workforce as they deal with childcare needs. What are your findings, and what solutions do you suggest? And how has the past year aligned with or surprised you in your research?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And Tammy, that was just the cutest story I've ever heard of any boss or supervisor doing. I love that. And I really hope one day I have a boss print out me and keep them in their office. But anyway, to lead into your question about childcare, and taking a drastic, tonal shift, because it's just been such an upsetting turn of events in the COVID economy and in how we've seen this pandemic play out for so many workers. I think we've probably all seen the headlines. It's been really hard, and it definitely exposed a lot of pre-existing cracks or just gaping inequities in the childcare system. And I think researchers are kind of just realizing that where we once had, a strained childcare industry, it's really just a broken market at this point. You have basically providers where the cost of doing business of providing childcare is just ridiculously expensive now. It's not really an industry that's providing a return on investment. You have huge fixed costs of providing PPE for different childcare providers. And at the same time, kids are pulling out overwhelmingly of their childcare slots. So it's just kind of like an untenable relationship at this point between families and providers. And what really sucks about this arrangement is that both of those are super vulnerable groups, right? I mean, working parents, especially for younger kids, that's a really vulnerable group. Young children in general, a really vulnerable group. And at the same time, providers are overwhelmingly women of color, who are often small business owners. So it's just hard. It's a seesaw balance between two groups that deserve a lot of federal attention and focus, which are both really struggling right now. So it's been just really disheartening to watch. And at the same time, in the beginning of the pandemic, the Census Bureau began this survey, which was a weekly survey looking at how households and businesses are faring. And without getting too nerdy and too in the weeds, this was very cool. I don't want to, not cool as in it was like neat, but it was interesting because for so many policy researchers, you don't really have the opportunity to know what's going on in the current moment in the fields that you're studying. So this was a totally unique opportunity to say, how are childcare providers doing in this week relative to 3 months ago? which was just data, on the ground data that was not available prior to coronavirus. So it's been kind of interesting because it's illuminated so many struggles that are going on for working families and the childcare industry, for providers. So it's like, not only did this crisis kind of exacerbate all of these structural issues, but we also have a clearer vision of it than we ever had before. So it's just been a very interesting time to be researching childcare. It's a very interesting time to be, looking into how families are faring. And there's just, overwhelming data that people are struggling now more than ever. And I put out a paper a few weeks ago that, a majority of states are seeing parents exit the workforce overwhelmingly because of childcare. And also lack of K-12 schools being in session, which are issues that are hard to disentangle from a data perspective and kind of go hand in hand to some extent. So very long-winded answer, just to tell you that I think it's been a really hard time for working parents. In terms of solutions, I think we're just going to need stronger federal investments in really securing and shoring up this industry, both from the family perspective and from the provider perspective. The extent of our investments in federal investments in childcare right now are pretty family focused. So we provide a lot of family subsidies through the Child Care Development Block Grant, which are great for helping families pay for childcare, which can be really expensive. But more and more, we're just seeing childcare providers shutter their doors, which creates all of these, downstream effects. You're basically raising prices for all the centers that do remain open, which it's a cascading negative cycle. So I think we're going to need to see stronger investments. I think we have the right administration that cares a lot about investing in childcare. So I'm definitely heartened by that. And I'm just hoping to see more federal attention and more emphasis placed on supporting working parents and supporting, especially, our youngest citizens who deserve strong investments in their formative years.
Thank you so much for that answer, Gina. I mean, following from that, we've seen how the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed or uncovered certain structural inequalities and struggles that people face. Ms. Hiler, have you seen the same thing happen in the education field? I know you've recently written on the shifting opinions of students in the value of higher education. How has that changed in the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are your opinions on federal action required to solve that?
Yeah, so, going off of what Jillian was saying, a lot of our work right now, so she's focused on really the childcare space, and a lot of the work that I do in the education space right now is focused on higher education. There is a whole lot happening in between those two fields that we could spend lots of time talking about, but, that bleeds into one another. But when it comes to higher education in particular, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I would never say that this past year that there have been too many silver linings, but I do think in some ways, and maybe Jillian was hinting at this a little bit too, it has really uncovered a lot of things that people have been talking and thinking about in the education field for a really long time, and it has busted those conversations wide open in a way that I think and hope will be really helpful moving forward. So one of those big conversations is around the value of higher education. I'm sure as all of you, currently in the higher education space, you're paying tuition bills as we speak. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about student loans and debt and things in the news. I think that when it comes to the value of higher ed, I will say we've done a lot of public opinion research. And the one thing that we're not hearing as much about is the fact that, people do still overwhelmingly see the value of getting a college degree. And actually, I think that this past year has almost proven that more than ever, because we've seen that the way that, this recession has played out or started to play out and probably will play out is very much a tale of two recessions, right? There's a lot of people who have been completely isolated and protected and are, doing just as well now as they were a year ago, versus a lot of people who are struggling a lot harder. But one of those defining characteristics, of course, is a college degree and getting higher education and sort of being in jobs or fields that are sort of more recession proof than what we've seen in the past. So I think that overwhelming sentiment, what we've seen from students and likely voters and a lot of the research that we've done, still remains very true. That being said, undoubtedly these conversations about, okay, how much am I actually paying to go to school? I think the abrupt shift to online learning at a lot of institutions sort of cracked this wide open in the sense that, people started much more vocally asking out loud, like, why am I paying the same tuition to go to my classes online that I was paying when I was in person and using facilities and all of these things? And so in terms of asking questions about return on investment and really trying to better understand what they're paying for, that is something that I think we're seeing really, there's a really big uptick in those conversations. That's going to have an important impact on the policy discussions that we're having in the next year to 2 years, or at least, as the Biden administration begins to roll out their plan, as they install they just have a new Secretary of Education that started last week or was confirmed last week, and start to fill out those cabinet positions. I think that we're going to see a lot more in terms of focus on oversight and accountability of institutions, and also just really trying to figure out, what are the investments that we need? How can we target them to the students who need them most? And how can we sort of, use this crisis that we have all just experienced in a way that can permanently, hopefully, alter a trajectory that, similar to the childcare space, higher education was very much on a trajectory that just feels very unsustainable for the long term. So that's kind of where a lot of our public opinion research has been focused. And when it comes to, some of the other things that we're thinking about, I think that in general, just better transparency in the space, in, the fact that right now we don't have a ability to, there's a ban at the federal level called a ban on getting student level data. So right now it's really hard for us to even have a clear picture of who's graduating, if students are transferring, if they're part-time. We aren't able to disaggregate data by certain racial or income characteristics that would make all of the policies that we want just better and more targeted. So I think that's going to be a big focus for Third Way, along with, as I said, a lot of just accountability policies and making sure that we're providing better consumer protections for students.
Wow, really a lot of exciting and useful information. Now that you've said, so many policy objectives that you guys have, I wonder how you guys choose a communication strategy and how you prioritize which topics are the ones that are gonna be in the forefront.
I'm happy to take a stab at that, but Tammy might have a little bit more to say on that front. I tend to think that policy conversations in DC are pretty online driven, for better or for worse, which means that you just need to have a very solid communication strategy. You need to know what your objective is. You need to know what your angle is, who your audience is, who you're hoping to reach, and really distill that quite succinctly, which can be hard. Brevity is the enemy of nuance. So it can be hard to really grasp the scope of your entire angle, what you're thinking, where your evidence is, all of those details that come with having a policy perspective. But it requires really knowing very deeply what you want and who you want it from, because I think so much of our communication strategy is online focused. The upside is that it tends to make for really strong graphics. I think we work really hard at Third Way on having quite digestible, shareable graphics to put online, which I love working on. I think it's a really great skill to have, and it's a very marketable skill, very useful, which is super important for achieving our goals. Tammy?
Yeah, I just add a couple things to that. I think that One of the things, though, that is a danger of having the conversations completely driven by what's happening online is that it's often easy, I think, in DC in particular, for organizations or groups to sort of think like, oh my gosh, this like universe of people on Twitter that are really active, really, really care about this issue. But really, you know, part of our job is actually like also figuring out what are members of Congress and their staff really hearing from their constituents? What do their constituents really care about? And, you know, oftentimes those are very different conversations. There's a very different universe of people who are talking to each other all day on Twitter versus real people in the real world that are reaching out to their, you know, to their members and have issues that they're talking about around the kitchen table. So I think that's another reason why Third Way spends a ton of time doing public opinion messaging work and just, you know, trying to really field in the real world what issues, you know, people want to hear about and want to see Congress in particular tackle, which then helps us, you know, sort of hone in on where we can have the biggest impact. And just, you know, because there are so many different issue areas too, and, you know, this may look a little bit different across program areas at Third Way, but one of the things that, you know, our team in particular, when we're trying to figure out, okay, where should we focus our energy, because there's always a million and one things that we could be talking about, we sort of use a Venn diagram that has 3 circles to sort of guide our thinking. The first is just resources, you know, like, do we have the time and the resources to actually work on a particular issue area? Second one is passion. We want people on our team and at Third Way to feel inspired and engaged, as Taylor was talking about at the beginning, about the work that we're doing. And then the third one that I think is something Third Way does very, very well is the third circle is unique value add. Because we're a think tank that, you know, we're a center left think tank, which means that our main customers tend to be moderate Democrats, and in certain issue areas, we work with moderates on both sides of the aisle. You know, I think that there are a lot of issues that we care about as a Democratic think tank that a lot of other groups on the left are thinking about and talking about and focusing on. But there's some harder issues that sometimes require a little bit more nuance, or things that, you know, moderates care about that, you know, you might not hear about from folks on the left or the right. And that's really where I think Third Way can come in and really help shape those conversations. And so, yes, to Jillian's point, like, we totally love that we're seen as like translators on the Hill. You know, we know that staff typically on the Hill have, you know, multiple portfolios or issue areas that they're working on at one time. And so they don't have time to read a 30-page, really wonky report with a ton of data if they're going to have like 20 minutes to read something, and they're going to be fielding questions from different lobbyists all day long. We sort of see it as our job of saying, like, how can we distill information in a way that is as 101 level is humanly possible and helpful, so that if a staff, you know, if they have a lobbyist that comes in and starts asking them questions or drilling them on an issue, that they at least have a basis or a foundation to know which questions to ask in return, or where to push back, or where they want to focus on. And so, yeah, there's a lot more there, but happy to answer more questions. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as this conversation goes on.
Of course, I think it was really interesting, the Venn diagram approach. We've recently heard from other persons, from other experts on the fly-in, the importance of funding and getting the resources needed to be an advocate. But following from that, I wanted to read a quote from the website that I found really interesting. It says, diversity, equity, and inclusion are the cornerstones of Third Way's culture. And I wanted to know more ways in which you ensure that this happens, and yeah.
Yeah, I can just jump in quickly, and then Jillian, feel free to add to that. I mean, I think like a lot of organizations, this is something that, you know, Third Way is really trying to do really well, and making sure that we are integrating sort of DEI into everything that we're doing, not only when it comes to thinking about, our own internal HR processes and hiring processes, that sort of thing, but also when it comes to the policies that we work on and the issues that we advocate for, and making sure that we are very inclusive of, in particular, other voices or communities who are being directly impacted by the policies that we are focusing on, so that, we know that we're a think tank in DC. We're very much oftentimes taking a, 200 foot above the ground level, and we're not a grassroots organization. So we don't necessarily naturally have a group of students, for example, that we can call on to work on different policies. But that doesn't mean that we can't and we shouldn't be integrating as many partnerships and other voices into the work that we do. And so I know that that's something Third Way has tried to make a very concerted effort of, especially in the last few years. I've been at the organization now for over 7 years, and I've seen a really big shift in the way that we try to approach this work. But we're by no means perfect. And I think it's always a work in progress, and something that we are really trying to be honest and earnest about in the conversations that we have internally as an organization, and really trying to just, do the work and not just talk the talk. But, I'd be lying if I said that we were 100% where we needed to be. But I think it's a mission and a goal that means a lot to the people that work at the organization. And it's important to us because we know that that's really, at the end of the day, what matters, especially because we work on policy that impacts real people's lives. Jillian, I don't know if you have more to add there.
Yeah, I would. This is something I think a lot about because my academic background is in economics. So it's a lot of spreadsheets. And when you're looking at a spreadsheet of unemployment data, it's really easy to just think of these big trends as numbers. And it's so important to constantly remind yourself that every single unemployment number represents millions of people, millions of families who are actually struggling and going through hard times. And I think that's something that this pandemic has really hit home for a lot of policy researchers, which is that there's a real human side to a lot of the things that we think about and talk about in these like kind of anesthetized terms all the time. So a way that I try to think about it, and that I think my team tries to combat it, is by bringing in a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different groups when we write about different topics. Our organization is very fortunate that we have a lot of Hill contacts. We have a lot of friends on Capitol Hill. We have a lot of different people that will answer our emails. And the best way that we can use that and leverage that is by using those contacts to help other organizations that might not have those contacts themselves. And by bringing in stakeholders that could really do well with a meeting on Capitol Hill with a representative, and would do well to impress upon them their mission and their goals and their perspective on different policy issues. So I think it's all about just knowing what your strengths are and knowing how you can bring other organizations with differing perspectives to your own into the conversation. Because I think that's the best way to really make sure that you're using your leverage to the fullest of its ability, and including perspectives that you might not have at your own organization. So that's something I've tried to keep in mind as this pandemic has wound on, and as we've seen all these different bills go up onto the Hill. It's something that's really important to keep in mind.
Thank you so much for your answers. Really interesting. It's wonderful to know that there's always room to grow and room to be better. Coming from the inclusivity and diversity question, I wanted to ask more about the gender issues that women experience in think tanks. Being this woman in politics fly-in, my question is, what is it like to be a woman in Third Way, and what are some of the challenges women face in general in advocacy work?
Take the first stab at that. Like I just said in my previous answer, coming from econ, it's also a little weird because econ is so male heavy, specifically white male heavy. So it is just, it's constantly like one of those imposter syndrome kind of things where you have to tell yourself like, no, I know just as much about X, Y, and Z issue as the person that I'm in a meeting with. Or I know how to do math too. Like I can run numbers too. And just, fighting the instinct to kind of quiet down, or fighting the instinct to not say what you're thinking, which can be hard, but I think it comes with experience. It comes with working somewhere for a while and growing more comfort in your own skin, and finding the strength of your opinions and of your voice. But it's definitely can be challenging at first, especially when you're new in your career. I'm on the younger side, so I definitely feel this often, but it's really great when you have people who, like to Tammy's point, she's been at Third Way for 7 years. So I'm sure that Tammy makes it a point to advocate for younger people when she's in meetings with them. And I think being cognizant of things like that, of speaking up and making sure that everybody has said their piece and has their opinions respected, is really important in fostering more inclusive conversations at the organization.
Yeah, and I can just add, both internally at Third Way and then also within the context of the work that I do, I'll say that I don't know what the actual breakdown is, but there does feel like there's gender parity within the organization itself. But as I was mentioning, as some of you were on the call at the very beginning, I have a 2-year-old daughter. And when I was pregnant at that point, even though I'd been at the organization for 7 years, there had only been 2 other women who had given birth during that time. At the time, Third Way's parental leave policy was not where it needed to be, and it actually, I think, drove away those 2 women from the organization because it wasn't sustainable. And so when I came on and I became pregnant, first of all, I did a scan of the staff, and I was the only mother on the entire staff, except for our HR director, but her children were, adults at that point. And I know that it was really important to me because we sort of have this wave of, women in my age bracket where it's like, okay, there could be a baby boom at Third Way at some point in the future. And so it was really important for me knowing that, like, okay, I'm the first mother in a long time. I'm going to need to be advocating for policies, and I need to be a leader in terms of helping to reshape the parental leave policy that we have at Third Way so that it is more sustainable. And I was really grateful to the organization that they allowed me to help be a part of that process and have some of those conversations, which isn't always something that organizations are willing to do. And I knew that, they put in place a 12-week policy. And at first I was thinking, well, should I just take 10 weeks? And then I was like, no, I'm taking my full 12 weeks because that's what I need. My body needs full 12 weeks after giving birth to a baby. But also I knew that it was because I was going to be a leader to every other woman who came after me who gave birth, that I didn't want them to have to question if there was something wrong if they took 12 weeks, because there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we have policy that allows you to even add on sick time or vacation time or other things where you could even extend that further. So, that's one example, I think, too, just trying to be really aware, as Jillian said, of we try to pull each other up as women and stick together and be able to have those conversations. And I should also mention that this policy extends to the fathers at Third Way too. I don't want it to just sound like it's, only a maternity leave policy. It's a parental leave policy, which is great. But then in terms of the higher education work that I do, it's really interesting because when I started at Third Way, I was doing only K-12 policy, and K-12 policy is a very female-driven policy space. But when I made the transition into higher ed, it was somewhat abrupt, and learned very quickly that K-12 and higher ed policy, they don't talk to each other, which you would assume. It's 2 very different, distinct, siloed communities of policy work. And I felt like when I got into the higher ed space, I was immediately, in meetings to the point where, Jillian was saying I was new to the policy area. I felt very I can't speak up. I don't have authority here. I'm learning the space. I attended a lot of meetings and conferences where it was just all men, manels, right? All men panels. And it felt like there was a lot of mansplaining happening. In fact, I was in one meeting once where, actually this happened again to me recently, but I laughed it off this time, where a man was holding up work that I had done and said he was disappointed in me. And I'm like, okay, you're not my dad. Also crazy. Don't tell me you're disappointed. It's fine. But anyways, I, just sort of was talking to another woman in the higher ed space a couple of years ago and was like, is there like a networking happy hour or something for women in higher ed? And they were like, no, but why don't you just start one? So I did. And I just very organically sent out an email to people. At the time, there was like 20 people on the list, and said, hey, does anyone else, like, would anyone else enjoy this? Have the opportunity to just talk to other women in higher ed? And over now the span of like 2.5 years, this list is over 700 people. We regularly hold these happy hours, and it is like so clear that I was not the only woman that was feeling this way, and that like this community really, first of all, there were a ton of women in the higher ed space. I just wasn't as aware of them, and we weren't talking to each other. And so that's been really great too. And it's led to a lot of like job connections from other women, helping other women lift up in the space. So all that to say, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself and think about the women that are going to come behind you. And also don't be afraid to, start the happy hour. If you feel like it's not there, start it, and you'll be surprised to see how well received it will be.
I just want to say quickly that I started at Third Way almost 2 years ago. And I remember before I started reading our employee handbook and thinking, wow, Third Way has an amazing parental leave policy, and being like so impressed by it. And I never knew that it came from you, Tammy. And that's so awesome.
Well, it didn't just come from me, but they let me participate in it. And Taylor was there when it was a bad policy, so she remembers the other side of the story.
Well, the upside to that is that thankfully Third Way, and I think a lot of organizations in DC, think tanks and advocacy groups are understanding that there can't be a disconnect between what they apply to themselves versus the policies that they espouse, right? There has to be, that would just be counterintuitive, and it would not align with values if their internal policies were different than the policies that we were externally fighting for.
I mean, those were such like excellent responses. I have no words. I mean, to Jillian's point, it is something I have experienced, this imposter syndrome of, oh, would I be able to speak out? Is it okay? Do I have valid ideas? So, it definitely a salient topic. But yeah, I enjoyed it very much, her advocacy for herself. And I imagine it's much, much worse in like a master level program. And to Tamara's point, it is incredible. It is incredible that you can say, okay, if there's no happy hour, I'm gonna make my own happy hour. And if the parental leave is bad, then I'm gonna advocate for a better parental leave. So yeah, I think those are great lessons to leave our flying participants with. I wanted to give the mic to Britney for her to ask her question.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay, sorry, my internet connection is horrible right now. So my name is Britney. I'm a junior double majoring in English with a track in linguistics and public policy. And I'm also an undergraduate writing tutor. I'm losing connection. Am I good? Cool. Okay, so my question is just from like my experience, I've noticed a lot of students that come into the writing center heavily face linguistics discrimination. So my question's kind of like directed towards Ms. Hiler. Do you guys have any initiatives or research going on to advocate for students who may be a part of minority groups that are facing this type of, I guess, trouble in higher ed?
That's a really good question. The short answer is at this point, no, we don't. And I think part of that is always the challenge of figuring out like, what is the federal role there, which is a question in particular in the education space that gets tricky because I know this is a higher ed issue, but also just in K-12, people have a lot of strong feelings about the federal government's role when it comes to dictating certain curricula or the way that things are laid out, that oftentimes gets kicked down as, oh, that's a state or a local or a school specific issue. But that being said, I think that there's a little bit less of that in higher ed because so much of the funding for higher ed is tied to the federal government itself. It makes it easier for federal intervention to come into play. But that being said, it's not an issue that we've heard a lot about, at least at the level that we work out, but that doesn't mean that it's not important to the point we were saying earlier, like we're not hearing lots of Twitter fights about this, but clearly on the ground, this is something that matters and has a long standing impact there. So, I'd encourage, as you're thinking and seeing more of this on the ground, just trying to start thinking creatively about, okay, exactly what are the types of problems that we're seeing? What are the possible solutions? And then figuring out ways that you can either start to communicate that when you have the opportunity to potentially meet with, staffers or other people at the federal level who could be researching and thinking more about these issues. And I'm sure my email address will get shared at the end of this as well, or I'm happy to drop it in the chat, but, always happy to continue this conversation specifically with you afterwards if there, are things that you want to hear more about. And I don't even know if she dropped off and heard any of that, but I can always email her separately.
No, I did. Thank you.
Oh, you're there. Okay. Sorry. I couldn't tell. You like moved on my screen from where you had been. Perfect.
Well, if we have any, oh, there it goes. Jennifer, you have the mic.
Hi, I had a question because since the pandemic, it's been a little bit hard for individuals that have accommodations at university. Pandemic kind of made it difficult for students that need accommodations. For instance, people that need additional time or need different forms to actually be able to learn, since everything is virtual.
Sorry, what was the question? I think I missed the question.
What are some of the challenges that students with accommodations in colleges and high school students?
Yeah, so I mean, and Jillian and others feel free to weigh in on this too. I mean, I think that number one, like the very fundamental challenge that we're seeing with this move to online learning is the basic ability for students to even connect to the internet. And so I know that Jillian in the economics program at Third Way has done a lot of work around just expanding broadband access in general to make sure that students can actually get online and not just have internet access, but like the ability to have a video chat. Like that requires a high-speed internet connection, which can be very challenging. And then, yeah, in terms of, just the ability to get the particular accommodations that they need, I think that I wish I had a good answer for you that school districts or institutions had that figured out. And unfortunately, they didn't. And that's where I do hope this past year, it was the metaphor of, you're building the plane as you're flying it. I think we saw a lot of that from institutions in terms of trying to put in place certain policies and infrastructure that quite frankly, they hadn't thought seriously about until they have now been forced to. And it'll be interesting to see, what of those policies and accommodations that they're, I think, trying to make for students, which ones of those are they going to make permanent? Because this is, online education isn't going away. Even when things start to resume back to normal, we're still going to have a lot of students who might be in a hybrid situation where they're going to need accommodations in an online learning space. They're going to need internet access, that sort of thing. And so our hope is that we continue to provide the funding to institutions. We continue to find ways to connect and find models of places that are doing it really well. That's something we do all the time in the policy world, is like, okay, how can we scale, right? How can we look at evidence-based practices that are, doing something really well in the policy space? And then how do we basically try to take that model and scale it, not thinking that it's a one size fits all everywhere, but in a way that will be sustainable for other schools or entities across the country. So I hope that this continues to be a priority and something that institutions, make permanent as we, start to resume somewhat of a normal life.
Well, in case, just to wrap up the session, I would love to know more about career opportunities at Third Way and what is, ways that we can be more competitive for them. I know that there are internships, fellowships. We have both undergraduate and graduate students in the call. So if we could just get an overview for that.
I'm happy to kick us off, Tammy. Third Way has graduate fellowships. So for those who are completing graduate degrees, we do 1-year fellowships in DC, which are really great. I mean, you are all like, I'm sure that you're enjoying being in DC, and I think that it can't be overemphasized, the value of just being physically here and meeting people and networking and having the exposure to people working in industries that you're interested in. So I would definitely encourage you to pursue internships and fellowship opportunities. I can definitely, or Tammy, or I can send around more information about the fellowships that we offer. The one thing I do want to say that I think, if I could impart a kernel of knowledge, is that when I was in both undergrad and graduate school, I think I always was a little scared of imposing or asking for people's help or their time. And I always felt like, well, why would I take 30 minutes of this very important, fancy person's time when they're probably working on so many more important things than talking to me or helping me? But now that I'm in my current job, I love when people ask me for help. It makes me feel so great. I feel like if I can help 5 people figure out their career paths a little bit better, like that will mean that have given back. I've, completed the circle of life of providing advice and guidance. So with that in mind, email anyone that you are even remotely interested in their work. Like, they will answer, they will find it flattering. They will love it. And I don't know, even talking to somebody for 20 minutes, if they can connect you to another person who can help you out, like, don't underestimate the value of just asking for help if you think you need it. I'm totally willing to give anyone 30 minutes to just talk about what they're interested in, talk about my experience, and then connect them to anybody in my network. I think, the only real value in having a network is helping others access it too, and really expanding it through just, helping people when you can, and giving other people the same consideration that others have given you. So that's my advice. Find people's emails on the internet and just send stuff to them, and they will love it, and you will be better off for it.
Yes. I could not emphasize this more as well. And just the dirty little secret is literally every other person in DC got their job that exact same way and did the exact same thing. So yes, I couldn't echo that more. And same with even just, occasionally if you apply to somewhere, the person knows, just be like, would you mind just sending my resume to, if you're interested. That's how I got my job at Third Way. I didn't know anything about Third Way. I didn't really know anybody at Third Way, but my brother knew somebody who worked at Third Way who agreed to just flag my resume for HR. And so that moved me to the top of a pile that I probably wouldn't have ever moved to. I should also say that at the time when I applied to Third Way, a master's degree was required. And I didn't have a master's degree, but I applied anyway. And I got the job, and now have, been able to I started as a fellow at Third Way and have had 7 title changes since I've been there. So, I also think women in particular, we feel like we have to have 100% of job qualifications on, a job listing, and you don't have to do that. And lots of men apply to jobs that they don't have that. So just don't always let that piece of it limit you if you're worried. And then the other thing I would say, just in being in DC too, is, I think that there is always a lot of value in the policy space, having had some real world experience in the policy that you're interested in. I don't think it's necessary, but, for me, I was a teacher for 3 years, and then that's how I made a transition into education policy. And I feel like having some on the ground experience in the education field gave me a little bit of credibility as I was working through, gave me more of that on the ground understanding of the policy issues that was a benefit to me. So I think that that's something that you can also think about, is that to work in policy doesn't mean you have to jump straight into policy. You can go do things, test out other careers that are interesting to you. And then in some ways that might actually make your entry into policy even more fruitful or meaningful. And the last thing I'll say specific to think tanks is, I was actually just talking to someone from a student at Northwestern's graduate program had reached out to me and had been told by a professor at Northwestern that think tanks only hire people with PhDs, which is 100% not true. And I was like, that professor is giving you terrible advice. So just know that think tanks, like I didn't know what a think tank was till I started working at one, but there is a very wide spectrum of what a think tank can be. Yes, you have certain, think tanks like Brookings or others that they do hire a lot more PhDs in academics, but then you have third ways of the world and a lot of others where we're really advocacy driven. And we value people, like I said, who've had other experiences outside of academia. So just as you're looking more into think tanks and what that means, don't let a PhD or something limit you in that research.
I mean, I think that is fantastic advice. I have heard that before, that women tend to limit themselves until they meet all the requirements for a job to apply for it. But, if there's anything we learned here today is that we need to be fearless and we need to go for every opportunity that we can get. I will make sure to add your email in the chat so that other girls can reach out to you and keep this helpful environment going. That is it for me. I am so glad I got to moderate this session today. Yeah.
I'm also glad you got to moderate it, Laura. Amazing job to Laura for moderating the session. Round of applause to her. I can never go back to moderating anything after seeing how amazing all of you have done this week. It was great. And of course, thank you to Tamara and Jillian for your time and insights and support and motivation, and to Taylor for not only joining us, but joining us from a military base during training. Means a lot to go out of your way to show that not only folks like our guest speakers are represented at these organizations, but that our alumni are as well.